welcome to our first ever Twitter space. And what better day to do this than on International Women's Day? My name is Maura Leary, and I'm the Director of Communications at the African Center for Economic Transformation. We are really, really thrilled to be convening today's discussion, and we're doing this in partnership with the Association for the Advancement of African Women Economists. And what a group we have convening today. We have a group of African women leaders who are at the forefront of different aspects of Africa's transformation. They are advocates, economists, public servants, physicians, social scientists, communicators, and above all, they are pushing the needle on gender equality and transformation in Africa in various and important ways. Today, we're hoping to kick off a free-flowing conversation between the speakers and with those of you who are listening in. So I'm going to start with some specific questions to each featured speaker, and then we'll pick up many of the many threads that are going to come up in their answers. If you have ideas, those of you listening in, if you have ideas, questions, reactions, thoughts to share, please tweet them to @AssetForAfrica, and we'll be sure to have a look and weave those into the conversation as well. I've asked our guests to keep their initial remarks short, sweet, and conversational so that we can have plenty of time to chat today. And with that, let me get right into the discussion, as I'm sure we're all very excited to engage with today's guests. So I'm going to kick things off by going to Mavis first. Mavis, you're the Executive Vice President at Asset, and we are all about economic transformation in Africa. This month, we're kicking off our new gender program. So I wanted to ask you to really please set the scene for today's conversation. Why is gender equality and gender equity so important to Africa's transformation? And what's Asset hoping to achieve by kicking off this program? So over to you, Mavis, to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Maura, and welcome everybody who's joined us today in our Twitter Space conversation. Now, the case for gender equity, has long been positioned as a matter of fairness and justice. In recent years, it is more and more being posited as a human right. And we are beginning to get the evidence that shows that it also provides extensive economic returns for national economies. Despite all of this evidence and the fact that it's a human right, gender equality and economic returns and the numerous policy recommendations on how countries can make progress through gender equality is actually not being realized on the continent. Progress in Africa has been limited. Implementation of policy recommendations has been slow. We have pockets of excellence, but it's not at scale. And overall, the continent remains woefully behind other regions in the world when it comes to gender parity. It's not to say we are not making progress. We've seen progress on maternal mortality, enrollment of girls in primary schools. We've seen one elected female president and a few vice presidents step up into the presidential seat. But they are examples. We keep citing Rwanda, we keep citing Namibia and South Africa. What about the other countries? Despite the fact that Africa has the highest number of female entrepreneurs, women are the least supported on the continent. They continue to struggle as individuals and as heads of businesses. They have limited access to finance. They face a myriad of challenges, both culturally and in relation to regulations. And they just female-led companies seem to struggle to flourish. And prior to COVID, Asset did some analysis that said that Africa was regressing in its transformation journey. COVID has set us back even further, and all the evidence from international financial institutions are saying that we are projected to rebound slower than every other region in the world. We cannot afford to build back better because what we had before was just not good enough. We must focus our energies on building forward better. This means focusing on economic transformation and not just economic growth, and putting gender equity at the heart of that transformation agenda. We need to do this to transform at the pace necessary to provide meaningful opportunities for our rapidly growing population. And to do this, we must break the barriers that prevents 50% of our population from fully contributing to the continent's growth. And this is why ASET has selected gender equity as a priority program over the next 5 to 10 years. Our next flagship report is going to focus on gender equality and transformation. And what we will be doing with that report is we will be trying to understand why governments are not putting in place the policies and not implementing the policies that will enhance gender equality on the continent. We will work with governments to shift their focus from the current gender neutral economic policies to gender equity focused policies. We will be supporting governments to identify the levers that will drive gender equity in the policy space and the ones that are most likely to have the greatest impact. We will help them understand why policy recommendations on gender equity have failed to gain traction at scale in their countries and generally across the continent. And we will be helping them to look at intersectionalities between gender and other social and economic inequities to help them make faster progress in terms of transforming their economies. But most of all, as ASET, we will be shifting from our gender neutral space in all the advice, in all the advocacy, in all the work that we do in promoting economic transformation and putting gender equality at the heart of it. Thank you, Maura.
Thank you so much, Mavis. I love that shift from gender neutral to gender equality. I'm really hoping that we can see that progress really, really clearly in the next couple of years. I see a couple of other speakers have joined. Idah, it's great to see you. You'll see that there's a speaker invitation for you in your Twitter app. So if you can just click on that when you have a chance, we'll promote you to speaker and we'll call on you. But let me build on what Mavis has just said and turn to Yavi. So you are the head of the Pan-African Businesswomen's Association, and you guys have been focused really on the potential power of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I think this is one of those areas of intersectionality that Mavis was just mentioning. This is really celebrated as one of the biggest opportunities for Africa's progress and global bargaining power. So can you tell us a little bit of what you've learned so far about what the AFCFTA means for women and how women are contributing to the success of AFCFTA? What needs to happen now? Where do you see this going? And what have you learned so far? Over to you, Yavi.
Sure. Thank you, Maura. Can you hear me? I just want to double check.
I hear you loud and clear. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Mavis. A happy International Women's Day to everyone, actually, not just women, because we have male feminists among us and those who support in terms of gender equity. And I think that's the basis of where I want to start in terms of your question around the AFCFTA. So PABWA was founded on the basis of lack of in terms of the AFCFTA. PABWA was founded on the basis that when we looked at the agreement, the document that was signed way back when in 2018, I honestly thought I was losing my mind, to be very honest with you. I was reading this document, and bear in mind, you are in an environment where, the white noise around you says, there's declarations, there's women policies, there's governance, there's regulations, there's laws, there's all kinds of things. So how can this agreement, this historical event in the history of Africa, our last chance at being able to emancipate from aid, all of these kind of statements being made aligned to the AFCFTA, and then the agreement is gender blind and youth blind, with two very general comments, being referred to in two sections that I won't go into now. But that was the basis of PABWA. Since then, to go into the second part of your question, since then, it has been a road of looking at what needs to happen from a lobbying perspective and what needed to happen from a lobbying perspective, which has been done now and achieved, what needed to be done in terms of guiding, demanding, lobbying, all of those kind of good things in terms of ensuring that we have a women in trade and a women and youth in trade protocol contextualized within the AFCFTA before operationalization. What needed to happen in terms of being able to make sure that the women of this continent have access to the information. How do we democratize communication? How do we democratize information for their benefit in order to be able to make sure that the people who need it the most get the information that we need? And I want to give you just a quick reference point in terms of the fact that we don't really have much stats, and I'm going to come to that as my last point, but we don't really have much stats to define where and how and who contributes to the bottom line of Africa across the 55 countries' economies in terms of things like the informal trade sector. So numbers like 70%/80% are thrown around in terms of what women and informal traders, and that's where, the percentage comes from in terms of the number of women business owners across the continent, because they are seen as self-employed, all are constituted from an informal trade perspective. So if we do not formalize the informal trade sector, and I don't mean necessarily putting them into buildings and creating structures, I mean being able to create an environment that is enabling for them to be able to have things like access to finance, being able to grow and scale their businesses, being able to improve manufacturing, etc., etc., etc. So these are the kind of things that we have looked at, we have approached in terms of the final thing that I want to be able to kind of say this is where we're at now, is that, and it's one of my biggest passions, and Mavis knows that it's one of my biggest passions, is that monitoring and evaluation is sorely lacking on the continent. We have lots and lots of reports telling us what the gaps and the challenges are, but we don't really have information in terms of everything else, and we need to bring that all together. So we need to be able to have, we've had a 2010 to 2020 African Women's Decade. We now have a 2020 to 2030 African Women's Decade of Economic and Financial Inclusion. And if nobody does anything about it, we're going to get to another decade being declared and, creating policies and lovely documentation, but nothing actually activating and why we needed to be able to push progress and drive a particular agenda. So these are just the highlights and the summary points in terms of where we're at, what we're doing. I'm obviously not telling you everything, but in terms of the interest of time. But yeah, these are just some of the highlights and where we're at now in terms of being able to drive this agenda around the AFCFTA, but generally in terms of the formalization of women in terms of being able to have access to the financial and economic activities of the continent.
Thank you so much. And I think you're not alone in sometimes reading through documents and thinking you're losing your mind when you see sort of how completely gender blind they often are. So it's so great that you guys are working on that, and I'm really interested to hear more, I think, later in the conversation about the monitoring and evaluation, because understanding progress will be really, really crucial to this as well. I want to turn now to Moky. Moky, your organization, Africa No Filter, is supporting the development of nuanced and contemporary stories that shift what can be very stereotypical and harmful narratives within and about Africa, and especially about African women. So, I think we're talking a lot today about economics, about policy, about all kinds of things, but from your perspective, you're really an expert in this field and understanding the narrative part of this. How important is it as part of this work when we talk about transforming Africa to shift those narratives specifically about women in Africa? Over to you, Moky.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And yes, happy Women's Day to everybody listening. So, I run an organization called Africa No Filter, and we are specifically focused on narratives. So when it comes to conversations about gender and Women's Day, we focus in on what is the narrative around women, particularly in media. So, there are kind of three big issues that I'd like to talk about. One is the fact that we know that women are underrepresented, just quite frankly, just not seen as much as men. In fact, it's something like 24% of stories globally that feature people only 24% of them feature women. So men are getting far more coverage being written about. And in fact, it's something like 37%, I think it is, of stories written in newspapers, media, articles, a byline by women. So women aren't even in the newsrooms making decisions and writing the stories. And it's not just media. There was a report that was done a little while ago with Gina Davis, and it was about 2014. So it was a bit dated, but I'm sure it still represents the numbers. But she said even in films, only a third of all speaking parts in movies were women. That meant 2/3 were men. And where women were depicted, they tended to be sort of more sexualized, women in, short outfits, and, they were the romantic interest. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done in sort of better representation of women. But because although we are not being seen as much, where we are seen, the representation of women is still really not shifting the stereotypes. So, for example, when women are quoted in stories, often they're not the experts. In fact, it's only 19% of women are highlighted as experts in stories. This was a recent, well, actually wasn't that recent report that was done. And that means that 81% of stories feature men as experts. They're portrayed as the authoritative source. And in fact, the most recent report that I came across was one that was done about, how women were represented during COVID in the media. And that report, which was done by a company called ACAS, showed something like one woman for every 5 men voices was represented. So every time you heard one woman talk about COVID, 5 men had actually spoken before. So we have a long way to go. And where women were portrayed in the media, often it was women were the victims, women were the sort of human interest angle. So we need to do more about being seen as the expert in the room, which typically has gone to men. And I think that the third area is that, media stories don't really reflect some of the issues that women face, in terms of gender equality. In fact, there's something like 6% of news stories reflected our issues. Now, if people aren't writing about our issues, people aren't reading about, the issues women face, then no one's talking about them. If no one's talking about them, then certainly no one's motivating for new policies or trying to change them. So we actually have to do a lot more as women to be seen in public spaces, on public platforms, where we are seen, being seen in the right light. And thirdly, also just to make sure that we are talking about the issues. So platforms like this are great. But just a couple of things more I do want to say. It's not all doom and gloom. There has been a lot of progress. I mean, there's media organizations like the BBC who've got a 50-50 policy where they're trying to make sure that 50% of journalists working for them are women. 50% of the stories are they quote women on as well. In fact, one journalist did some research that if he tried to get as many women quoted in his articles as he quoted men, the story took him 15 minutes longer to do, which I thought was really interesting. So it does require a little bit more effort on everybody's side. And organizations like Quote This Woman, which sort of highlights women as experts and makes it easier for you to find a woman to quote in a story. And there's a lot more sort of funding of gender desks. We see things like there's fewer panels, there's more panels, where women, and there's great sessions like this where we're all women. But I do think there are a couple of things that women have to do. Media reflects society. Media doesn't make things up. So if we're showing fewer female experts, fewer women in leadership, it's because there are fewer women in leadership. I think one of the earlier speakers talked about the number of, women presidents, 2 out of 55 countries. We can do better than that. In time, there's only been 12 female prime ministers ever in Africa. So we have a long way to go in terms of, people in ministerial positions, still low. Yes, the countries, Rwanda, South Africa, but countries like Nigeria, 8%, very, very low. Countries like Morocco, 5.6%. So we actually have to do a bit more. So media can only reflect what society's talking about. And I think the last 2 things I'll say is that there's entrenched attitudes. So there's still work that needs to be done. with men who don't necessarily want to open doors or, let women through the doors. So I think there's work that needs to be done. But the one thing that I do tend to talk about a lot is that women need to get out of their own way a lot more, and I talk very much from the sort of representation and being seen, because I happen to do a lot of things that I always require women to speak, and it just takes a lot longer to convince a woman to come on a panel to speak up at something, and often they want to be in behind the scenes, or they don't think they know enough to be on a panel. And I think it's things like this that stop us. So it's actually women, we need to get out of our own way. So I'm going to end on that because I'd like a call to action. And that's just women, just step up and let's do these things, be brave.
Thank you, Moky, so much. I think that's a great call to action. Let's all get out of our own ways. And I want to come back to you later a little bit on where you think some of that change will come from in terms of representation. How can we get more women in positions of power, and how do we help women get out of their own way? What's holding us back? Because taking 15 minutes extra on a story shouldn't be a big deal, but that adds up. So how do we encourage more women to put themselves forth for these things, but also the people writing the stories to think of women first, which I think is another barrier. But I'll come back to you on that quite soon. Oh, Idah, I'm so excited you have been able to join. I know you've been listening along, but now I think you have the power to speak. Can we test your microphone really quickly?
Yeah, hi. How embarrassing, right? Yeah, I don't know. Can you hear me?
Not at all. I have the benefit of having done a test on this earlier, so I can pretend that I knew my way around a Twitter space before yesterday, but that's just pretending. So nothing to be embarrassed about. We're so glad to have you.
No, thank you so much. Please go ahead. It was fantastic listening to the speakers.
I'm going to go straight to you because we really want to hear your perspective. You've worked at the World Bank since 1995, so you've seen a lot. You've worked in South Asia, East Asia, Middle East and North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where you're currently the country director for Mozambique, Madagascar, Comoros, and Mauritius. So you've seen this issue of gender equity play out in a lot of different places in the world, not just in Africa. So can you share a little bit based on your experience, a little bit, since you've sat in an international institution and been across the table from a lot of governments and local institutions, what roles should international and local institutions play beyond individuals, et cetera? What roles should they play in accelerating gender equality? And have you seen differences in the other places you've worked in the world vis-a-vis where you're working now in Eastern Southern Africa? We'd love to hear your perspective. So over to you, and happy Women's Day.
Yeah, no. So thank you very much, Maura, and thanks to Mavis for inviting me. This is really a great opportunity. And, as an African woman, I really do feel that there's a lot that we need to do, particularly for our younger ones to come up and have the confidence of what it is like to be an African woman who, holds quite a lot of responsibility in a continent where I'm not so sure that it's always moving at the same step as we are. But let me give a little bit of the responses to what you say, and I'll kind of paraphrase to make it as short as my colleagues who spoke before me. So for the international players, I really feel that there's a few things that they need to do a little bit more. And the most important is to speak about gender inequality at a global scale. We need to be able to use numbers to illustrate and compare and contrast countries so that the bigger picture is available to a lot more people than we normally see. People are inspired when they see the difference between what can be possibly done and what is probably not being done, and you create new leaders in that space. They have to support a lot more advocacy, especially at the international platform. Let's remember many of these international agencies actually have the opportunity to meet with world leaders and other top leadership, and they can discuss and they meet to discuss global affairs. I really feel that gender equality and women's empowerment is a global affair. It should not be left only to the few who believe it, but it should really have a much higher profile. If you imagine that women are 50% of the humans on this planet, the issue is not whether or not we should be in sort of having women in the workplace, or whether they have a place to fit in the workplace. It should be asking ourselves, how can we as a society develop with only half of our human capital that is on the table? And I think international organizations also have the opportunity and the luxury of being able to track. What you don't track and it's not measured, you will never actually make progress with it. And so I think that there is a very big role there for the international players. When it comes to the local institutions, my own take, and from what I've seen, is that we need to build demand for women. We need for equality for women. We need to find and groom champions who can help advance the cause. They can also be the voice of why it's important that women are a part of this whole dynamic. And I think, the other thing that I tend to find, and I hear all the time when I talk to local institutions, they tell me, oh, you shouldn't worry about this. This is our culture. And I'm always telling them, there is no culture that has said, our women should not be a part of society. We have women in everything we do on a daily basis. It is an economic imperative to have our women be part of society. It's not just a good to have. It is really critical. And they need to also use the access that they have to international agencies, to other players, to support real change, by ensuring that there is actually information flow between policymakers and local champions and stakeholders. We often find this is a real challenging nexus where information, I go in, I speak to the president or to the prime minister, but information actually never flows down, and vice versa. There's a lot of discussion going at a local level, but the information never flows up to the policymakers. When it comes to the government, and I heard earlier a speaker also talk about the need to really change the policies. I actually want to focus on a few things that I do think governments, they know about, but don't always necessarily focus on. The first one are the very restricted labor laws. I've looked at quite a lot of labor laws for women and women in the workplace, and you'll be surprised that there are still laws such as women should not be working after 8 p.m. because it's not safe for them. Or women should, when you advertise a job, you advertise the job in such a way that actually it penalizes women to not apply in the first place. These are low-hanging fruit. It doesn't take a lot for government to change. We need to actually have more flexibility in the workplace. And I think if anything that we have learned from the COVID experience is that people can still deliver without being in the office. People can still be fully productive while they are working at home. For young mothers, this is not a luxury. This is actually really critical, particularly if we want to keep them in the workplace after they have their children. We need to be able to make sure they have daycare centers, they have creches, and the children can continue to learn in those environments. But we also know that there's a segment of women .
Idah, did we lose you? Kojo, can you hear Idah?
No, she's disappeared.
Okay. Idah, I think you've cut off for a moment. Let me just give you a second to reconnect, because you were right on a roll there. So I hate to cut it off right in the middle.
No, I think we lost her.
Okay.
We lost her.
Idah, we'll come back to you in just a minute to finish your thought, because I think you were very much on a roll on some interesting things that tie into what some other folks are going to be talking about as well. Since you were on the topic of labor laws and work, I actually want to go to Priscilla next, because you've been doing some really interesting work looking at women in the world of work, specifically in Ghana, including through a recent report that you did in partnership with Asset. So can you share with us some of what you've learned about the constraints and barriers that are limiting young women's opportunities in the world of work, beyond some of what Idah just mentioned, or complementary to what some of she mentioned? And I'd be really interested to hear also in terms of any generational progress. So are these things that are being passed down from generation to generation? Are today's women in Africa doing better than their mothers? Will their children be doing better than them? Do you have any ideas of how to break that cycle for future generations if we're seeing any kind of intergenerational transference of some of these issues? So Priscilla, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Maura, and happy International Day to everybody. International Women's Day, sorry. So indeed, in the report that I did for Assets, we realized that gender barriers that affect women in education and on the labor market remain pervasive, despite attempts at achieving gender equality in the country through different policies that have been enacted over the years. And despite pockets of success stories in recent times, the low representation, for example, of women in decision-making and elective offices in the country is an indication that policy is not having the necessary impacts. And indeed, policy, if not at best stunted, is very slow in terms of its impact in gender equality, particularly at the decision-making level. And when it comes to young women, we found that indeed young women often resort to their own networks, and then the differences that exist for young women is because of differential access to opportunity, education, skill training, and employment enabling resources. How do these barriers come about? We find that the barriers exist at the family level, where prejudice and stereotypes are passed on from one generation to another. So, for example, we find that young girls in their course selections basically rely on family and network, and they keep making recommendations to them in terms of career opportunities into female-dominated occupations such as teaching, nursing, and home care activities. And so for us to break gender bias, there is the need for intensive education at the family level. And even within the educational setting, we find that there is a low representation of girls in science, engineering, and IT-related courses. And indeed, young women do not have an idea of opportunities that exist for them in the labor market, particularly with the onset of technological advancements within the backdrop of the fourth industrial revolution, really. And so particularly honing in the world of work, the study found that rigidities in working hours, I think that Idah hinted on it, is a major constraint that women face, particularly young women with children, with young children. And young women have limited view of opportunities in the labor markets because of their over-reliance on family and social network for career guidance. So here we find that indeed mentorship is critical if we are to break the cycle of intergenerational transfer of these stereotypes. So based on the stereotypes and the self-selection of young women into female-dominated occupations, you see that we are not making progress in terms of representation of women in key sectors, particularly even within sectors that women are operating. They self-select into occupations such as secretaries, receptionists, ticketing for those in the hotel industry. In agriculture, they are into farming, distribution, selling. And so you find that women are self-selecting into these menial kind of activities within their sectors because that is what society expects from them. There are a number of issues, but I think that as the discussion goes on, particularly for women in entrepreneurship and agriculture, they lack access to resources, access to land, finance, equipment are major challenges because culturally, for example, women in some settings are not even allowed to own land, let alone young women. So these are major challenges. There are issues of sexual harassment on the job, which is something that policy needs to have a look at. And so for us to break the intergenerational transfer of barriers, I believe that education, constant conscientization of the society, parents to try to get away from this gender bias. And also particularly in one of the interviews we conducted, we found that, yes, a lot of families are shying their young women away from studying science because of the extended duration of the training. Women are expected to get married at a certain age, start childbearing. So family believes that women moving into engineering and medicine could unduly delay the onset of these activities. And so for us to break the intergenerational transfer of barriers, there is the need for constant education to break the cycle. I think I'll end here, Maura.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. A lot to chew on there in terms of the different barriers that women are facing. I think mentorship comes out very, very critically, and education and sort of helping parents break that cycle. That'll be very important as well. I want to quickly go back to Idah because I know you got cut off. So in case you had any, if you wanted to wrap up your thoughts, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Idah, come back if you want to wrap up your train of thought.
But help me out, Maura. Did you hear the part on the other countries? Because I think that's where I sort of lost you, right? That's where
That's where we
me,
started
right?
to lose you, just after when you were talking about work and things like that. So yeah, please go on.
Okay, so I'll just summarize what I found is different or similar in the regions that I've worked in. And basically what I was saying that, in most developing countries, actually the issue of gender inequality is very high, uniformly high. But the way it manifests can be different, right? In the way the inequality is actually seen or perceived, or how it looks on the outside. But the outcome of this poor equality indicators are that you end up with the girl child who has unrealized potential, and we see this all the time. You end up with very limited productivity for women, and very low female labor workforce participation, which is in reality, when you think about the fact that you're only working and using a part of your population, just makes no economic sense whatsoever. And what it does is that actually it pivots into the whole issue of poverty, because the less women are educated, the less they actually have access to financial resources. We find that it affects the family, including even the nutrition that they are able to feed their family. And you have this low human capital and cyclical poverty that becomes very entrenched, and that's a serious issue. But I ended up by saying that when you don't have women in the workforce, when you don't have women as key members of society, the world loses big time. And who in their own, sort of day-to-day life would ever want to only use half of the resources that are available to them? It makes no sense. And so why, we keep struggling with this issue of women need to go to work, they have a space in society. I truly feel that a lot of it also starts at home. And the previous speaker was talking about how you prepare your girls and the women to be a bigger part of society.
I think we may have lost you again, Idah, but you were wrapping up your thought. So that gives us a lot to think about as well. When you don't have women at the table, the world loses. I think that's a huge key takeaway, and an important thing to think about going forward. But we'll come back to some of the points that you brought up. especially on how things are manifesting differently. And I think the unrealized potential question is really important. What are we leaving on the sidelines when we don't empower girls and women equally to boys and men? That's a very important thing for the future. I want to turn now to Christabel. You are a physician. You've been on the front lines, especially of women's healthcare in Cameroon. And you found some very cool ways to use technology and communication to demystify health concerns and spread good information to the public. I think one of the issues that has come up from several of the speakers today is on how information doesn't get passed along and how women often don't have the tools or the information at their hands to sort of empower themselves. Human well-being is one of the key pillars of our growth with depth model that we follow at Asset. This is sort of our definition of economic transformation. It's the H of the depth. Human well-being is super important. You are someone who's right at the front of that. So I'd love for you to share with us, what are some of the barriers that you've seen for women in terms of accessing the information they need, the care they need, and owning their own healthcare decisions, which obviously has big impacts beyond just the individual. And what ideas do you have to help them overcome these barriers, both as individuals or also at this sort of community and country level? What kind of structures need to be in place to make this possible? So over to you, Dr. Christabel.
Thank you so much, Maura, for giving me the floor. And I must say that the previous speakers have really set a good scene and a soft landing for me, because just continuing from what Moky said about women getting out of our way and stepping up, I would say that the best thing for us as women, we have to ensure that as we advocate for gender parity, we need to ensure that women are empowered to actually take up these spaces and take up the responsibilities that come, because nobody is going to give us these responsibilities just by virtue of the fact that we are women. Now, if we're talking about women empowerment, I always start by saying there is this vicious circle that emanates from women poor health to women disempowerment, because poor health is both a cause and a symptom of women disempowerment. If a woman is in poor health, she definitely would not be able to go to work. If she doesn't go to work, she doesn't have money. She can't afford appropriate healthcare. So you just have that vicious cycle going round and round, and we need to find a way to stop the cycle. Now, talking about the barriers that I've seen most women face with access to healthcare is, first, they lack that access to specific healthcare services. That is, healthcare services that are specific to women's needs. We need to understand that women have health issues that need to be tended to specifically within the healthcare system. And most times, this is usually not considered when designing healthcare programs. Because when you go to design healthcare programs, you go into communities. Most of the leaders that you need to take permission from or you need to seek consent from are usually men. And if they don't accept that, go into the community and educate women and tell them about the health issues, you're not going to do that intervention. That's why it's important that we are talking about involving men in this in this gender parity and women empowerment agenda. So that's the first. And we saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic, that gap in women's access to healthcare actually increased, because you see in some countries, especially in Africa, where you had the lockdown and all of that, women who even before the pandemic couldn't access healthcare, now with the lockdown, transport, they couldn't get to healthcare, go to hospitals for the specific healthcare needs. They couldn't go to work, because most of the women who lost their jobs in the COVID-19 pandemic are women. They couldn't get money to go to the hospital, and they couldn't even access telemedicine services. So that equity gap in the access to healthcare services was actually increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then the second barrier we are seeing is actually poverty and financial dependence. And I think this is actually the crux of the matter we're talking today, that if we empower women to speak up, to step up, they'll also be able to step up economically. And that translates to the fact that they're able to afford healthcare and afford healthcare in the highest quality that they deserve. Because there are cases where in hospitals, I've seen women, they have to forfeit preventive and curative healthcare services because they can't pay. You have women telling you, oh, doctor, I can't do this test you're asking because I have to wait for my husband to come back from his journey or to come back from wherever he has gone to before I can do it. And in that case, we're delaying healthcare. You have women who tell you, I can't come for my cervical cancer screening, or I can't buy this medication or contraception. Even when it's free, they can't get it because they say, I need to get to my husband first. So we need to ensure that women are also economically viable to afford healthcare services in the highest quality that they deserve. And then the third barrier we're seeing is also the power dynamics, which always come into play in inequitable society like ours, where women are always on the disadvantage, where either your partner or your husband or a male figure has to give permission for certain for you to access certain healthcare services or information. We've had women who we have to delay a cesarean section because they have to wait for their husbands or a male figure in the family to sign the consent form. So those are all things that delay women's access to healthcare, which we need to ensure that we give women, we empower women with the education or with the information they need and the information about their rights to take decisions that directly concern them and concern their health. And then the third, then the next barrier we're also getting is the access to this communication material, radio, television, and maybe even phones. You have most women who actually need this information. They don't have access to all of these because even if you have your partner or the male counterpart are in the sitting room listening to the television, watching TV or listening to the radio, the woman is either in the kitchen cooking or tending to kids or helping them do their homework. And it is through these communication channels where you have most of the health information being passed, and the women, one way or the other, they lose it because they are doing other things or they're attending to other duties that by gender stereotypes or cultural norms have been attributed as women's duties. So we have to ensure that women also have access to this information in order to make informed choices. And then the last I want to talk about is about workplace policies. Because when we talk, oh, women don't go to work, because I can see that our advocacy for women's rights is actually working. We have more companies taking up gender inclusion and all of that. But the fact is, you have the gender inclusion, but we don't create the safe spaces for women to actually execute their duties. Women don't have to choose between, oh, should I be a mother or should I go to work? They should be able to pursue their career or be able to pursue their career without putting their health or the health of the children in jeopardy. Like lately, there's been a story going around on Twitter about a woman in Nigeria who left her 3-month-old baby in a crash and came back, the baby was dead. Many people suspect it's sudden infant death syndrome, but they are still awaiting autopsy results. And a lot of people keep going, oh, what is a 3-month-old baby doing in the crèche? Why is the mother so careless to leave a so young baby in the crèche and all of that? No mother accepts to actually leave her baby to a stranger to be taken care of. But if we had workplace policies that actually enabled women to raise their children without forfeiting the career, if we and most of the CEOs and the policymakers and people in leadership positions in these companies are mostly men. They are the ones who craft these policies. They are the ones who decide whether this workplace is going to have a crèche for babies, is going to have a safe place for mothers to, pump breast milk or to breastfeed their children, or to give flexible working hours for women to take care of themselves after childbirth and all of that. So it's to ensure that the men who are in these positions, leadership positions at work, are able to craft those safe spaces for women to actually have a good life or good health while they pursue their career. So I'm just going to end here for you and to give suggestions on this. The first thing I always recommend is, in all of this, we need to carry men along with us. We need to ensure that in this agenda, we make it clear that whatever it is not a challenge to men. It's we as women coming in, stepping up to be partners in development. It's not challenging men to take up whatever it is or to take their positions or whatever. It's for us to be able to share those responsibilities for Africa's economic transformation. And then the second thing is we need to do more in getting to women in those spaces where they're most comfortable. You have meeting places where women sit and talk in communities. We have women go maybe to the river to fetch water. So we have to ensure that we are meeting women in the places where they're most comfortable to talk about the issues that they are most concerned about. And then we also have to craft workplace policies that ensure that women have a good health. Women are able to pursue their career, especially concerning their sexual and reproductive health, which in most cases, their career and workplaces tends to be a barrier. So I'm just going to end here for now, and I'm going to give contributions as the discussion continues. Thank you, Maura. Over to you.
Thank you, Christabel, so much. And I hope you saw the hearts and likes and lots of applause coming from our speakers and our listeners as you were speaking, because I think you touched on a ton of issues that have come across through our other speakers and that women around the world are experiencing in terms of the kinds of choices that we are forced to make between family and work, the kinds of policies that are set many levels above our heads that impact our daily lives. And the really important thing that I think you brought up, and a few other people have brought up, that this isn't about women versus men. This isn't about men being disempowered so that women can be empowered. There's room for all of us to be empowered and room for all of us to be at the table. So I think setting this up as not something where someone has to lose for others to gain, but really that we just create a bigger table and make sure that there's space for everybody to be empowered is super important. So thank you for bringing up all of these different points. We'll come back to you later in the conversation as well. I want to turn to our last but not least featured speaker, Dimpho. I want to come to you really on the issue of young women and youth. You are the community manager at Youth Lab in South Africa. You're part of the Youth Transforming Africa Network, and you've done a lot of work on trying to mainstream women's participation in community building and policymaking, specifically young women. We know that, a fifth of the global population under the age of 25 lives in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment. That population is going to grow. And in the next 20 to 25 years, Africa is going to be an incredible powerhouse in terms of buying power, production power, innovation power, with a huge youth population that will be impacting the world. So I'd love to hear from you a bit about what are some of the examples you can share of young African women contributing to Africa's transformation, and what more needs to be done to make sure that young people, especially young women across Africa, are not just seen and heard as the occasional panelist or seen and heard and brought into conversations occasionally, but really listened to and treated as equal partners in Africa's transformation. So over to you, Dimpho. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maura, and happy International Women's Day, everyone. I think this was a bit of a challenging question, right? Because young women in particular, I think, are leading a lot of the positive change that we're seeing on the continent right now. And so to find kind of particular examples or to single people out was a huge task. But I think I'll start here. When I think about transformation, I think about efforts to really drive long-term and sustainable change, right? And positive impact. And usually that change needs to happen structurally for it to be sustainable and meaningful. So I think about changes that happen politically, for example, and I think about women who are working to bring about change in legislation and policy and through leadership and governance. And so I think about social and political movements where women have really been at the forefront, especially on the continent over the past couple of years. I think here in South Africa, things like the hashtag Me Not Trash movement, even though the hashtag is controversial, it did do a lot of work to bring about change, particularly in the space of gender-based violence, because we saw amendments to certain laws. We saw new laws being introduced to deal with GBV and violence in the country. I think about hashtag EndSARS, for example, in Nigeria, where women were also kind of at the forefront of that, particularly on social media. I think about women who are leading the fight against FGM in Rwanda and Ethiopia and other places on the continent, especially in East Africa. But I also think about, I think, my own personal experience, or my first experience being part of a political movement, and the role in which women played in that and how instrumental I was. And that is Fees Must Fall back in 2015, or hashtag Fees Must Fall, which was basically a nationwide movement calling for free education in South Africa, free high tertiary education in South Africa. And I just think about these young women who are coming from different political parties, kind of leading hundreds of thousands of young people and students throughout the streets of South Africa. And what a significant moment that was for young people, because it didn't just end there. After Fees Must Fall, we actually started seeing a lot of young people assume very important positions in provincial leadership structures, important positions in parliament, right? I think about people like Naledi Chirwa and Catherine Siabe, and people like Nompendulo Mkhatshwa, who's an MP and part of the ruling party in South Africa. And then I think I come to structural change that is economic. And I think about how women have really been breaking barriers in sectors that have become vital for Africa's economic transformation, things like agriculture and technology and entrepreneurship. And how, and I think one of the speakers made mention of this, African women remain the most entrepreneurial in the world, despite the fact that they are underfunded. So those are just some of the things that come to my mind when I think about women leading change that is like fundamental and structural, and I think really playing their part and a very crucial part in bringing about transformation on the continent. And in terms of what needs to be done to make sure that young people, and in particular young Africans, are heard, I really like that question, especially when you think about the average age of an African statesman, for example. We don't really have a track record of allowing young people to lead. So I think the first thing we need to do is make it law for young people to lead, right? In Nigeria, they have a not too young to run bill, where young Nigerians kind of started a movement to reduce the age that people can run for presidency for, I think, to the age of 35. So we need to start there. Like, we need to actually legislate young people becoming leaders and assuming important political positions. I think we also need to kind of create interventions with young people and not for them. So coming from the advocacy space, where I work on a lot of programs and initiatives that are meant to empower youth, I think a lot of the times we come with the mindset of creating for young people and not with them, and kind of not respecting them as experts of their own experiences. And that leads to us tokenizing young people, right? So kind of consulting with young people, or only allowing their voices at the table as some kind of box ticking exercise, rather than really engaging with them in a meaningful way. I think since I've become the community manager at Youth Lab, one of the really consequential policy moments that I've been a part of is drafting the national youth policy and the subsequent kind of consultation processes that took place after that. And one of the things that was really important for me to note is how we also treat young people like one big homogenous group. Youth in South Africa, for example, are categorized age 15 to 35. That's a huge gap, right? And if you think about the needs of a 15-year-old versus the needs of a 25-year-old, or the needs of a 35-year-old woman, those things look completely different, right? Socially, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of what they need economically. One of these people, these people at completely different stages in their lives, and they require different support. So I think that's also one of the barriers to really being able to listen to young people and being able to create pathways for them to participate meaningfully, socially, politically, and economically, so that we treat them as one big group. But these are people who have very diverse experiences. And once again, when we allow young people the platform to talk about their experiences as experts, I think that's when we really begin to listen to them, and I think engage them in a more meaningful way, and in a way that really creates change. I'm going to end it there for now. Thanks, Maura.
Thank you, Dimpho. That was great. And I think this idea of, you talked about youth as being treated as one big group, and I think you could transfer that very easily to women. Being treated as just one big group of women need this and women need that. But there's a lot of nuance in the different groups of women, the different backgrounds, the different things that women need in different parts of the world, but also at different age groups and things like that. So it's something very important to keep to keep in mind. So thank you for that. So there's so much on the table at this point. It makes me want to stay here all day, but I know we have about 30 minutes left. So I want to bring up a couple of the points that came across in a couple of different people's interventions in different ways. One was on monitoring and evaluation. So how do we track progress, and how do we make sure that we have those systems in place in advance rather than sort of flying by the seat of our pants? A lot of people will say, what gets measured gets done. So do we know enough? And do the systems that we have in place now do enough, or what are some suggestions that we have for improving that? I think, Yavi, you brought it up first, so I may go back to you. The second thing I want to kind of put on the table is how do women get out of their own way, which is something Moky brought up and I think is really important. This idea of, is it about women empowering themselves? Are there structures that need to be in place? Does it all need to happen simultaneously? This is obviously a group of women who have gotten out of their own ways in a lot of ways. So I'd love to hear from some of you any advice that you'd have for women listening today that are just starting out, or who are in the middle of their careers and may want to sort of have a bigger voice or progress in a different way. I think some of your advice from your personal perspectives would be really, really interesting. And the third thing that I think came up is the idea that this isn't doom and gloom. And this goes back to the narrative question, but in general, we talked a lot about barriers today, but there's also a lot of opportunities, a lot of great examples of women leading across Africa, young women leading, whether advocates, economists, in their own spaces, just really leading the charge. So I think that that's an important thing to bring up and maybe revisit. And the last thing was on bringing men along with us, and having men be really central to this conversation. So it's not just women pushing for women, because this is a societal issue. This is about transformation. This is not just about one group trying to compete with another or anything like that. So those are the couple of things I wanted to pick up, but anything else that any of you want to react to, feel absolutely free. Maybe let me go back to you, Yavi, just on the monitoring and evaluation question, because I think you brought that up. If you have some ideas you want to share, or if anyone else wants to jump in on that, please do. Let's start with that as a follow-up topic.
Sure. Thank you, Maura. Wow, what a conversation, and so many different levels of or dynamics in terms of what we need to be able to look at and how we need to be able to take it into our spaces in order to make it real. Because a lot of the times, and I'm specifically referring to looking at it from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, is that Africa is known for, we talk a hell of a lot, and we are great at policy creation and regulations and documentation and those kind of things. But implementation, action, return on investment in terms of all of that effort is sometimes elusive, added to various other things, traditional, cultural values and systems and patriarchy that plays out, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, it's not as simple as saying, let's go off and do a study, let's do this, let's do that, let's try and find out. Because in ignorance is bliss, or intentional ignorance is bliss. And with that means that we don't really know the full capacity of something when we're not monitoring, evaluating, and measuring something. And because we can't measure something, the old adage goes, you can't manage it. So when we looked at what are some of the things that we need to definitely look at, and I'm going to give you a quick example of this, and it's not we can talk about it for many, many hours, but I just want to give it to you from a high level perspective. So the African Union a couple of years ago declared that, and it's a policy, that 33.33% of all public procurement needs to go to African women-owned businesses. That has never been monitored, evaluated, measured. We have no idea what that looks like across the continent. We have no understanding of it. Let me put that into context of a study that was finally done in South Africa last year, 2020, and the results were released in 2021, is that, so what South Africa did about eight to 10 years ago, in line with the whole 50% women cabinet policy creation and all of the things that we refer to now, is that the president at the time said, okay, he's going to step it up and he's going to create 40% women-owned businesses for public procurement. The first study after many years was done in 2020. We got the results in 2021, and that results revealed that it was up to 8%, somewhere between 6.97 and 8%. So because there was a 5-year gap between the study and the declaration, so because there was no evaluation, because there was no understanding of it, and because there was no, whether it's an incentive from a carrot perspective or, wrap over the knuckles, we don't necessarily drive implementation or activate or action it unless it's in some kind of evaluation process. So the monitoring and evaluation aspect in terms of all these declarations and policies and all of these kind of things, unfortunately, need to be done. As I said, that the timing is right now, because we've got lots and lots of women in positions of power at the various seats in various seats at the various tables across the continent, whether in government or in the African Union or in other civil society entities that are able to drive that in one voice. So I think the timing is right now to be able to put some of those things in place. Having said that, we also have to understand that it's going to be a difficult journey in the first few years at least. It's not going to be as easy because we do have to battle certain aspects of patriarchy that can't be put into statistic terms, if I can put it that way. So these are just some of the things that I'm just giving you kind of a high level perspective on in terms of what needs to be done and how we need to approach it going forward. I have spent the past year and a half driving that, or navigating the political minefield in terms of getting agreement and being able to draw that kind of attention to this. And it has taken, just about a year and a half to get that right, that we are now ready to be able to drive a proper full-on monitoring and evaluation process. But yes, we had to get out of our own way. As Moky said, we had to help other people see that they had to get out of their own way. And definitely, I think just to finish off this is that we don't even though we're a women's organization, we don't think about it from a woman's perspective. We think about it from an African perspective, purely because if women are talking to women, that's a filter bubble. And the echo chamber means that we're never going to get anything done. So we drive an agenda or messaging from an African economic transformation perspective, because if Africa wins, it's women win, because we will make sure of that. So these are just some of the sentiments and some of the aspects and the approaches that we've used to be able to try and just navigate all the various issues that are playing out in a world that is run by money. So at the end of the day, there are various issues facing women: GBV, conflict, silencing the guns, all of those kind of issues. But the world runs on money. So we need to make sure that economic transformation of the continent has to include women and their growth and their development. And then obviously, as the next priority, is youth, because we have the most number of single women in the world on our continent. So we don't want our youth to be even further marginalized.
Thank you so much, Yavi. Thank you for that. Mavis, I see your hand up. Come on in.
Thanks, Maura. So, I'm a big fan of this quote: "What is not defined cannot be measured. What is not measured cannot be improved. What is not improved is always degraded." And I think that if we don't get the data to understand where we are making positive progress, where we are regressing, we will not be able to make the progress we need to make. We will not understand where we are failing to break the biases that is making it difficult for women to fully participate in the economy. So that we have data on the continent, and this is not just an African challenge. Globally, data on women is weak. We need to improve the collection of data. We need to be able to understand both quantitatively and qualitatively what is not going right. So the policy recommendations are robust, targeted, and can really drive change. That was it.
Thanks, Mavis. Moky, I thought I saw you unmuting your microphone. Did you want to add something?
No. Well, I wanted to go back to the question about sort of how we get out of our own way as women, because I think a lot of these conversations we have are about what needs to happen, what policies need to change, what men need to do, what attitudes need to change. And I think those are things we need to do. We need to continue to do that. But also, I think there's a role that women have to play. And the reason why I think that's important is that we have to be careful about positioning ourselves as victims, because that contributes to that stereotypical narrative that I talked about earlier, that if we're always seen as the victims in this gender thing, we're going to continue to look like that, and that's not a message we want the world to go to have about women. So just to my point about women getting out their way, I mean, I used maybe quite a trite example of how getting people to speak. I mean, I was on a Twitter chat earlier on today, and as expected, the only people that stepped forward to ask questions were men. It starts with little things like that. It starts with having our voices heard, being on platforms, speaking out, staying where things are not going right, or where things are not, the right policies aren't in place. And, I think, I can't remember the name of the lady, very famous lady who wrote the book, about leaning in, and just women actually putting their hands up and saying, no, it's not okay. And that's us. And I think this whole thing about women getting out of our way and just being a little bit brave. There's a lot of women that says, "Oh, you don't understand. You can't run for politics because they'll kill you." But they'll kill the men too. Politics is brutal. It's dangerous. I'm not saying people should stake their lives on it, but I'm saying that there's certain things that we have to step up to if we want to be in the game. If we want more political leaders who are women have to get into the game. They have to get into politics, and it's a dirty, brutal game anywhere in the world. If you want to be the CEO of your company, you have to be in with all the politics that goes with that corporate environment. And women tend to step back. And one quick example, I have a friend who used to be a CFO of listed companies. She's on about 5 or 6 boards. I asked her to do a talk, and she says, "Oh, no, I like to be behind the scenes." My question was, why? It's not about, flaunting yourself or doing your own PR. It's about standing up and being counted. That is how we get out of our own way.
Thank you, Moky. I think we lost you a little bit at the end there, but what I was hearing from you was that women need to get in the game, stand up, be counted, and that it's not about positioning women as consistent victims of a system, but really as fully empowered actors in their own lives to be a part of this transformation. So it's not necessarily about it being someone else perpetuating something on women, but that women have to also step up, get out of our own ways, and really be brave. I think that's a really important point. It's scary sometimes, and I think everyone here has probably been in that moment when there's that sort of slight fear of raising a hand or sharing a thought or any of that kind of stuff. But we have to push past that. So anyone else want to add on to this or share even your own experience about how have you been able to push past that nervousness? Most of the women in this call are working in, or many of you are working in fields that are traditionally dominated by men, whether it's economics, whether it's the medical field, whether it's policy. It's very hard to raise that hand and to push past. So does anyone have any experiences they want to share or advice they would share with anyone listening?
Maura, it would be great to hear from some of our audience if they have, they have anything they'd like to share as well.
Yes, I have a couple of people queued up. Let me go to Dimpho quickly, and then I see Mercy from the Kugota Foundation. I will go to you next, Mercy. I see your hand up. So Dimpho, let me go to you first, and then we'll pull in a couple people from the audience. Thanks.
Yeah, a quick one from me with regards to getting out of your own way. Last year, I read an article by one of my peers that I really respect. Her name is Violette Dubese. She's in the technology and startups space. And she had written an article on the badassery of self-promotion. And it was basically about how to go about promoting your work, whether it's with your peers in your professional network or using social platforms like LinkedIn. And she also went into the reasons why, and particularly African women, kind of shy away from talking about the incredible work that they are doing as just a cultural thing, like a cultural experience, right? So a lot of us are taught, as a woman, you kind of just need to be quiet, you need to be meek. You can't speak up about your achievements or accomplishments, like wait for someone else to compliment you. You basically can't own that experience. And so after reading that, I became very intentional about talking about the things that I was doing at work as a freelancer. I started very small on things like WhatsApp, for example, before getting my LinkedIn profile together, because women are really brilliant, but for some reason, we shy away from talking about that brilliance. But if you're not sharing with the world or your professional network about some of the things that you have achieved, no one's going to know about them. So if that is helpful to anyone out there, there's a lot of power in self-promotion, and I think you can start small, and that's one of the ways you can get out of your own way.
Thank you so much, Dimpho. Mercy from the Kaguta Foundation, I see you here. We've just sent you a speaker invitation. Did you want to share? There you are. I see you've just joined. Mercy is joining us from Uganda. Do you want to share some of your reflections on the conversation so far? We'd love to hear from you. So Mercy, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Mercy Agaraho, and I'm the Communications Manager, Kaguta Foundation. So I'm here on behalf of Kaguta Foundation. I don't know whether you can hear me because I had issues with the network. I wasn't getting what you.
We hear you well. We hear you very clear.
I was not following the conversation, like I was on and off. I think I had issues with the network, but I'm so happy about the space and the topic of the day. Women are transforming Africa, that's the truth. And what I have to say on my end, I don't know whether I'll be off topic since I wasn't following the conversation, but what I get to know about women in Africa is that they really start it. What I'm meaning to start it is that a woman down there in the village is the one that starts it. If it is to do with farming, they're the ones that go on ground and do the farming. So I really feel that Africa and the woman out there is really not appreciated enough because we don't see their value. We see the end results of the woman, what she has done. If she has done farming, then we get to see the food on the table, but we don't get to see the process she passes through to get that food on the table. So if it is farming, then they have transformed it starting from the grassroots. So I really feel the world should appreciate a woman on this day and all the days because they do that hardcore work down there. And also I really feel that if we are to start this, it should start from home. Let's groom our kids from home. Our boys, actually not only girls, but even boys. Let them get to know the value of a woman from childhood because we all get to know that charity begins at home. So let's get to train our kids to know the value of a woman. And also what I have to add is that let's train a boy child to get to know how to handle a woman with power. Because I think that's the issue we have gotten in this era where we are empowering a woman and we are seeing women transforming Africa. We are seeing women becoming presidents. So how do I if I'm a man, how do I handle that woman with power? So I think we need to teach a boy child how to handle a woman with power. I submit.
Mercy, thank you so much. I think those were great points. And even though you cut in and out of the conversation earlier, I think you touched on several of the things that came up in the conversation. But I love that point of women being kind of at the heart of everything. If you're eating a meal, there's probably a woman who is at the start of where a meal came from. Women are part and parcel of everything in our lives, and we need to empower them at every level and recognize them at every level. So that's very, very important. And the starting early with girls and boys, very, very important. So thank you so much for sharing that. We really appreciate it. I got a message from Idah because she is having trouble getting back on as a speaker. So I want to just share, she had something to add specifically on the measuring and the monitoring and evaluation. And she said, I think we should track results and measure results, not just to show progress, but also as a way to advocate for better results. So we must not mix data for research with data for people to understand issues and demand better. People understand comparisons, and the digital world has made it easier for people to see and define what they want more easily. So use data not just to track, but also to advocate. I think that's very important. We only have a couple of minutes left. So anyone who has additional points they'd like to share, or any wrap up, anything they'd like to leave the audience with, please feel free. Priscilla, I see you opening your microphone. So Priscilla, let me come back to you.
Yes, Maura, thank you very much. On the issue of women getting out of the way, we find that a lot of young women do not see their kind in the career spaces. So in the occupational arena, they don't find a lot of role models in women. And most of the times, you also find that the women that are up there are not also too accessible to young people. So I would encourage that women in positions of influence make a conscious effort to mentor young women under them that look up to them, because indeed, it is quite a daunting task as a young woman, particularly those in the science and STEM related areas where you don't find women in there. Role models are difficult to find. And I also back the discussion, the fact that it is not about women alone. A lot of men also lift women up, serve as role models. So indeed, it's not a zero-sum game, but wherever women find themselves, I think we should make a conscious effort, because we are not the favored group. And if you are fortunate enough to get into a position of influence, you need to make a conscious effort to lift other women up. And then together we can break this generational cycle of bias against women. Thank you, Maura.
Thank you, Priscilla. Any of our other speakers? Christabel, do you have anything you'd like to add before we close?
Yeah, sure. And I think the previous speakers just wrapped it up perfectly. And also somebody from the audience who highlighted that boys have to also be taught, because we risk focusing so much on girls that we forget that the male counterparts are going to be the boys. So we have to ensure that as much as we are empowering girls today, we're also empowering boys to also understand how to live together and partner together for Africa's economic transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christabel. And Idah, I see you've rejoined as a speaker. Any final thoughts you want to share with the group and with the audience?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? I've been having real issues like Mercy
We hear
also
you.
said. Okay, so there's just one thing I want to say about this journey of women and getting women into the next step. I think mentoring is definitely something that we need to focus on, and I think everybody has said that. But I think that there's a nexus that we don't talk a lot about, which is the whole informality section. Today I was talking to people, and if you look at people, the big informal sector who are going across the borders, who are trading, who are doing a lot of things, it's women. What we need to do is to see how we can capture that energy, that innovation, and move them just one step further, so that what they are doing is actually much more productive, it's much more useful, and it actually has a much bigger impact. So I just wanted to plug that in, because I know Mavis is looking at some of these economic factors. I actually think it's a section we should not forget, and I wanted to end on that. I know it's a little bit tangential to what we were talking about, but I do think it's still an important piece to put on the table. Thank you, Maura, and thank you so much for organizing this. It's been a really riveting session, and I look forward to another session next time. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Idah. I want to pass the mic over to Mavis. If you have any final thoughts and final words, since Asad is hosting and convening this amazing group today. Anything you want to leave us with today, Mavis?
Thank you, Maura. It's been a thought-provoking conversation. So my takeaway today is that as women, we have a lot more power in our hands than we give ourselves credit for, and we should claim it. And we heard this from Moky and Dimpho very strongly. We need to claim that power. We can also work together to break the bias. However, we also need to acknowledge that there are spaces where we struggle to navigate. So as we think through where we currently have access because we are focused on economics, we really need to think through where in that space are women struggling to break the glass ceiling, and how do we use our knowledge, our networks, our access, our convening power to give women a voice to truly share their experiences and help us work together, including with our feminist brothers. I see a lot on this platform with us today, including working with our feminist brothers to help us make that next step. And I think for me, the biggest takeaway is going to be, how do we track this decade of women's inclusion, financial and economic inclusion? How are we going to be able to name and fame and shame the countries that are really making that change and scaling up gender equity? So that would be my takeaway. So everybody watch this space. We hope this is not the only conversation. It's one of many we will be having over the next few years as we work on our gender transformation program. And we look forward to collaborating with all of you. So thank you for joining us. Back to you, Maura.
Thank you, Mavis. And I think that was a perfect way to wrap up today's conversation on women transforming Africa. I want to thank Awi for co-hosting with us. I want to thank Yavi, Mavis, Dimpho, Priscilla, Idah, Christabel, Moky, Marcy, everyone who has contributed today. And we look forward to engaging with you further, as Mavis mentioned, over the next months and years on what is a really crucial issue in Africa's transformation.